Hey folks, welcome to week 10 of Intro to Digital Media Design. How is everybody? I hope you're all staying safe and keeping busy. All right, so as we dive into week 10, let's take a look at the syllabus. So last week during week 9, where we were all sort of getting used to being online, you guys did your next media analysis, number 2, which was all about art. Remember to turn that in today on March 30th. It is due, so be sure to turn that into Canvas under Media Analysis 2. Hopefully you had some fun with that. Those are some great pieces of art. I hope you really enjoyed them, and I'm really looking forward to seeing your analyses. Anywho, moving on to week 10. Okay, so this week we have a new topic. We're going to talk about narrative contraction and expansion. We did discuss this week 2 briefly. We'll get into it a little bit more in depth this week. Go over some examples and sort of talk about what that is as a visual concept. And then we're going to talk about our semester project, step 4. You guys should be working on the draft for step 4, and we went over the sort of guidelines for step 4 before we went on break, but I'm going to go over them again today just to make sure everybody's on track. If you haven't started your draft, you really want to get moving on that this week, so we'll talk about that some more. And there's a couple of videos to watch, which I'll point out and you guys can watch on your own. All right, so starting out with this week's topic, narrative contraction and expansion. Let's take a look at that. Okay, so what is the idea of narrative contraction and expansion? So the basic concept is that objects or items in real life, whether they are animate or inanimate, have stories about them that can be told. And we looked at some examples in terms of seeing versus looking, but really once you have sort of ascertained what something is all about, you can then tell a narrative about it and really go on and on about it. In fact, I wrote sort of a very short, somewhat goofy one here in the syllabus about Bob, and this gives you an example about what I'm talking about. So for example, if you look at this photo here of the apple, which we've seen before, and then over here this is my story meter, right? So the higher the story meter, the more story or the more narrative that can be told about this object. So as we sort of discussed before, right, this is an apple on a tree in an orchard, and in looking at it more closely we can see that the apples are wet, and so therefore perhaps it rained recently or somebody watered the trees recently, and then we can start asking questions. Well, where is this orchard? What time of year is this? What's going on? Who owns the orchard? What do they do every day? What are their names? What are their families like? And so on and so forth. The more questions we ask, the larger the story can get. You could tell a really huge story. You could make up an entire fictitious narrative about this apple orchard and all the people involved in the apple orchard. And if this was a creative writing class and you were particularly imaginative, you could probably come up with a really long and detailed story about it, because there's so much here just in this photo, and then your imagination can run with it. Even something as simple as this purple reflection right here on the front of the apple. Well, why is it purple? What is that all about? Perhaps a spacecraft is landing in the orchard and it's giving off a purple reflection, and now our story can go in a whole other direction, something more science fiction. Now, of course, as imagery becomes more simplistic and it is simply just an image, the story gets a little smaller. So if we move down to this version of the apple, which we've looked at before, you can see our story meter drops a little bit. There's maybe less to tell about this apple, because we know in this image that even though it's a real apple, it has been removed from its natural background. It's sitting on a white background that's either been sort of set up or fake. It's been photoshopped for sure. There's some stuff going on. Most apples don't have this perfect one leaf and one stem. This is meant to represent sort of the perfect apple. And so while it is a real apple, there's really less we can tell about it because there's not enough information here. We could talk about maybe how it got into this state, being in this white box, as it were. But really beyond that, the story gets a little bit smaller and there's less you can tell about it. Okay, then we move into this drawing of the apple, and the story gets a smidge more small. We can now, even though we've lost a lot of elements about the image in terms of its reality, we have gained a couple of things. It's clearly a drawing of an apple. We can see somebody's signature down here, so maybe we can talk a little bit about who this person is, right? Looks like J-C-A-S-P-E-R, J. Casper. So who is this J. Casper person? We could potentially tell a story about that person and why they did this drawing. But again, generally speaking, particularly about the apple itself, we have a little bit less of a story to tell. All right, now moving on. If we move into another version of the apple, now we get into a simple black and white icon or pictogram of the apple. And now the story is much smaller, right? There's so little information. It's a black and white graphic of an apple. We don't have any evidence that anything has happened to it. It wasn't removed from a background. It wasn't originally a photograph. There's no signature about who created this. It's just an icon, and we see these things all the time. Clip art, iconography, pictograms, whatever. Pretty simple. Doesn't have a lot to say. And so as the image gets smaller, in terms of its visual representation, the story we can tell about it is significantly smaller. Now, what's really interesting is that when you simplify an image and you turn it into an icon for no particular purpose, the narrative story that's attached to it is small. But as soon as you apply a purpose to it, meaning you turn it into part of a branding campaign or part of an identity system or part of a logo, now it has the potential to have a much bigger story. Now, of course, if we were just starting a new business and this was like Fred's Apple Company and this was the logo for it and nobody had ever heard of Fred's Apple Company, well, maybe there's not a lot of story yet. But if Fred's Apple Company gets really big and really popular and a lot of people love Fred's Apple Company, now all of a sudden the story about it gets larger and larger and larger and larger, and it just gains more information because the more people that interact with it, the more people have opinions and stories about it. And so an example of that, of course, in keeping with our theme here, is the Apple logos. Now, Apple Computer Company has a huge story, a much larger story, because people have experience with it. People know what it is. It's been around for a long time. People have either positive or negative experiences with it. They have stories to tell about it. If not, they at least know people who know something about Apple. And so even though visually this is a very simple black and white pictogram, similar to this one, it has a much larger story than this one simply because of what it represents and what its story is. So that's really sort of the basic idea of story contraction and expansion, essentially the size of the narrative that can be either invented or told about a particular object gets larger or smaller depending on its purpose. The more realistic the image is, the more there is to talk about. The less realistic the image is, the less there is to talk about. And that changes the minute that object becomes a logo or a part of a branding campaign. And now the story gets even larger than it was, perhaps, in its realistic form. Okay, so hopefully you guys understand that concept and sort of appreciate it and can keep an eye out for it in real life when you see logos. Think about, what does that logo mean to you? What do you know about that company? And what is the story you can tell about it? Or perhaps multiple stories. Furthermore, this doesn't just go for single objects. This can also apply to representations of other things like buildings or anything, really. Okay, moving on. Now, continuing our sort of investigation into visual literacy themes this week, over in announcements, we have 2 videos to watch that you can find. They are right here: The Magical Science of Storytelling and Visual Storytelling 101. They got released on the 28th, so they'll be available to you. The first one here, The Magical Science of Storytelling, is a TED Talk with this gentleman here, David J.P. Phillips, who talks a lot about storytelling and the importance of it in both corporate and business settings, and he talks a lot about sort of the importance of story. And then this one here is more specific to our semester project with regard to our title sequence. This is from Film Riot and talks about visual storytelling basics specifically for film. So this one is definitely more about our semester project. So this will offer you some insight and inspiration into working on your title sequence. Okay, speaking of which, back to the title sequence. So back to the syllabus here. We are, of course, for homework this week, working on the draft of step 4 of the semester project. Now, we took a look at step 4 before we went on break, but I wanted to go over it again in case you weren't there, or just to sort of refresh everybody's memory. So let's take a look at that. So this is in the semester project handout. So we are, of course, now it's ready to build your title sequence, at least make a draft of it so that it can get reviewed and then you can improve upon it. So step 4, now that you have chosen and reimagined your classic movie and show, of course you're all doing movies, so, and you have learned a bit about title sequences, and you've collected some inspirational and useful visual and audio content, it's time to start building and planning that title sequence. So let's look at the specifications, things that you have to pay attention to that are required of this title sequence. So first of all, content. Your title sequence must be a minimum of 10 slides or states. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means as we talk about the way in which you can build it. But essentially it means that the screen, the objects on screen for your title sequence has to change a minimum of 10 times. And we'll talk about a little bit more of that in a minute. You must include in your title sequence the name of the movie and the names of the lead actors. You do not have to include anybody else. You can, however, for extra credit, if you would like, add things in like the director, the producer, secondary actors, supporting actors. It's entirely up to you. But this is a fairly time-consuming project, so you definitely don't want to be spending too much time on adding in, typesetting for too many different people. So just stick with the name of the movie and the lead actors, and then if you have time and you want to add in some other people, you are certainly welcome to. Okay, and that of course is covered here. You may also include other individuals or organizations if you'd like. You may include photography, graphics, illustration, iconography, music, or sound effects. Now by now you have a theme. By now you have a general look and feel that you want to go with, and now of course you have collected all your photography, graphics, illustrations, hopefully your music and sound effects from those sources that we talked about before. Try putting them together in ways that make sense with your theme. Use images that look as though they go together, they support each other, and they look like they come from the same place. Okay, next, under the category of design, primarily your title sequence must tell a story that is in keeping with and enhances your chosen movie, its new genre, and your theme, right? Like I said about collecting your imagery, make sure that you're making choices in terms of use of imagery, choice of type, use of color that supports your theme. If you're going for a dark and moody theme, then make sure everything looks appropriate for that. If you're going for a happy and upbeat theme, then make sure things look appropriate for that. You can choose any visual style that you feel is appropriate for your movie. You can pull the style from any form of visual art, any movement or artist. So we've looked at a variety of those as recently as last week, and so perhaps you might want to implement some of those to give your title sequence a certain type of look. Good typography and layout are expected, as is excellent craft. Now, you guys are not design students, so you have not taken typography classes. However, the good basics of good typography is pick no more than 2 fonts. Make sure that it's clear and readable, but certainly have some fun with it at the same time. Don't make it boring, but make sure that we can read what's actually on the screen. So there's that balance between sort of fun and interesting type and very readable type. And in terms of excellent craft, make sure that you are really taking good care of your content and setting it up in a way that is clear. Now let's talk about how you can build your title sequence. So you can build your title sequence basically using any of these 5 ways of making it, and it goes from easy to more difficult. This is not really the class where you want to teach yourself brand new software you've never used before. You may not have the time to get it all done. However, you can certainly experiment. I would not discourage you from doing that. Okay, so the first way that you can make your title sequence is on paper using traditional art media and or collage techniques. If you completely do not feel comfortable using any digital tools, you are welcome to do this on paper, as if you are making storyboards, basically one piece of paper per slide or per state, as it were. And I say paper, but of course something like illustration board or Canson paper or watercolor paper would probably be more appropriate, something a little more heavy duty. So you can totally do this on paper if you really prefer those types of art techniques. Of course, you will have to photograph each one so that we can see them, but that is probably the simplest way to make them in terms of technology. All right, next, and this is probably the most common way people make them in this class because it's software that people are really familiar with by now, is you can use either PowerPoint or you could use Keynote. Or you could use Google Slides, some sort of presentation software to essentially create your title sequence that way. Now, this works well because you do have to have a minimum of 10 slides. So, of course, since those presentation softwares are built around a slide system, then that's pretty easy to figure out. 10 slides equals 10 states, so not too difficult. Now, of course, as you probably know, PowerPoint, Keynote, and Slides has animations and transitions built into them. which allows you to add certain types of effects as you transition between slides or between objects. You can certainly use those to your best of your ability to make your title sequence look as though things are moving or entering the screen or exiting the screen. So these types of software are really good as well for creating a title sequence. Okay, next up in the difficulty chain would be Apple iMovie, which is this here. If you are familiar with iMovie, it's a sort of a consumer grade but professionally built video editing software. It comes free with all Apple computers, so if you have access to it on your Apple computer, then it's pretty easy to get to. Now the learning curve is not very high on it, and if you've used it a little bit before, maybe you're going to want to expand some use on it now. It's entirely up to you, but you're certainly welcome to do that. Now, options 4 and 5 are really the more complex options, and I really only recommend these if you have used them before. Adobe Premiere or Apple Final Cut Pro are professional grade video editing software. iMovie is basically a simple version of Final Cut Pro, but they're very complex and they're difficult to use. So unless you've used them before, I really wouldn't recommend them. But if you have, absolutely feel free to use them for this assignment. And then the last one, Adobe After Effects, is a special effects program that works in conjunction with either Final Cut Pro or Premiere to add all sorts of professional grade effects to your work. Again, a really complicated piece of software, and if you haven't used it before, I wouldn't recommend it, but if you have, you are certainly welcome to. Okay, so that's the overview of what step 4 is. Now, of course, we're going to do this twice. We're going to do it as a draft, which you will submit to Canvas. It is not due until, moving on, it is not due until week 12. So you have about 3 full weeks to really get the draft done. So plenty of time to work on this. Once you submit that, we will all give you some feedback on it, a little bit of critique, and then you'll be able to go back and make some changes and update it, and then that'll be when you will work on it for the final. So we'll be doing it twice. So anywho, you certainly want to get working on that if you have not already. Okay, if you have any questions or unsure of what to do or get stuck, certainly be sure to email me. I am always available via email and I'm happy to answer your questions. All right, overall, I hope you're all doing great and are taking good care of yourselves, and I will talk to you soon.